They are generally censorship resistant and resilient to things like network failures. So, for example, if a government doesn't like what your blockchain is doing or doesn't like the data on it, there's probably very little that they can do about it. And similarly, if you have hardware problems and some of the nodes on the network fail, that is not going to affect the overall network. And updates to the blockchain happen by consensus. Anybody in a public unpermissioned blockchain, anybody can submit a transaction to update the state of the blockchain, but there is a consensus arrived at by the people involved in the system. And the really important part, the reason that I'm shouting it on this slide, is that there is no central authority. There is no one that can go in and revert transactions if you've done something wrong or can fix something for you. So this is the really important difference between blockchains and many other types of systems that you will have worked with. The fact that there's no central authority influences the design of the blockchain and also influences what we have to think about when we're thinking about security. Okay, now how do we achieve some of these features? Well, blockchains typically have some kind of shared public ledger. So everybody that participates in a blockchain will get their own copy of all the transactions of that blockchain. So if I'm talking about a public blockchain, such as Bitcoin, you get all of those transactions, so you can inspect them yourself, see who sent what Bitcoins to whom. And the network this is built on, they're typically built on a peer-to-peer network. This is an ad hoc network. Anybody can leave the network at any time. There's no central authority to give you permissions to go on the network. So this makes them very resilient. The third part that blockchains rely on is cryptography. And there are two aspects of this that are important that we really need to think about. The first one are hash functions. So are people here familiar with hash functions? Quick show of hands. Okay, great. So really in blockchain, what we're using these for is to fingerprint data. We want to be sure the data that has gone into our blockchain hasn't been tampered with, so we can take a fingerprint of the data by running it through a hash function. At a later time, we can do the same thing again and be sure that it is the same data that was there originally. The second aspect of cryptography we use is asymmetric cryptography, public-private keys. Now, we're not really interested in keeping messages secret here. What we're interested in is to try to prove the origin of a transaction. So in this case, we have Alice. She starts a transaction and she will sign that with her private key and submit that to a network. And even though it's encrypted, everybody with her public key can then decrypt it. But the point is that they will then know that the transaction definitely came from Alice, or from the person who owns Alice's private key. Now, these ideas, this technology had been around for a while, and particularly at the turn of the century, there were people trying to work out how to use this to do some kind of electronic cash. But it really all came together in about 2008, 2009, when someone called Satoshi Nakamoto put out a white paper explaining the Bitcoin protocol and started the Bitcoin network. Now, nobody knows who Satoshi is. If he's in the audience today, please come and talk to me afterwards. It is not this guy. This guy is Dorian Nakamoto. He had to put out a disclaimer via his lawyers to say that he is not Satoshi. We don't know who he is, whether it's one person or a group of people or an alien or a time traveler, we don't know. And he's gone quiet lately, so maybe we'll never know. But what he did was quite revolutionary and very practical. He started off the Bitcoin system, and I mean, it's been working since 2009, very successfully. For a public system that's open to being attacked, it has worked, I think, very well indeed. I'm going to talk about the data structures involved in a blockchain. Now, this is really an idealized view. Different blockchains will do this in different ways, but this is just an idealized view of the kind of things that you need in a data structure. So typically speaking, we start off with block 0. We call this the genesis block. And then it's just at regular intervals of time. So in the case of Bitcoin, this will be every 10 minutes. We will add a new block to our system. And so on. At the moment, I think there are, in like the Ethereum blockchain, we've got about 7 million blocks. So these blocks are just being added to over time. And these blocks consist of really two main parts, a header and a set of transactions. Transaction into the blockchain network, it gets put into a block, and then the header is added to the block, and that block is passed around the network and will be accepted by all the participants in the system. Now, the reason this is called a blockchain is that the fact that these blocks are chained together in a certain way, and this is done via the header. So a header contains a number of fields, and again, this is just an idealized view. Different blockchains do these differently. Some will contain many more fields than this. But they will contain a hash of the transactions in the block, so we have a fingerprint of the transactions in the current block. So we will know, we can always check whether the transactions have been tampered with in that block, because we have a fingerprint of it. The way that they are chained together, these blocks, is that the header will contain a fingerprint of the previous header, so the header of the previous block. And they will also contain, I'm talking about systems that use what's called the proof of work consensus mechanism here, but they will contain some proof that some work has been done to produce this block. Now, in producing this block, we make this process difficult, we make this expensive to produce, and this is done to prevent tampering. So if you think of someone comes along, we've been producing many blocks, we maybe got thousands of blocks in our system, and someone wants to interfere with that, someone wants to add a transaction in to an earlier block and claim that is a valid transaction, claim that is part of our system. What they would have to do with that is they would have to change the transaction part of the block to add the new transaction in, or to change one of the transactions. But once they've changed that, then the header will no longer match. The hash in the header will no longer match a hash that would be taken of the transactions. So they would have to change the header of that block also. But then that header will no longer match the hash that is in the next block. So they will have to change the header of the next block also. And then, again, that will no longer match the header in the next block. And so they would have to change every block from the point where they've changed the transaction up to the current block. And if there is an economic cost to producing blocks, this provides an economic disincentive to tamper with our system. And in the case of Bitcoin and Ethereum, this is the main mechanism that we use to prevent our blockchain from being tampered with, and to keep the integrity of our blockchain, is via an economic disincentive. Is that all okay? Okay. Now, I think if I can produce this, okay, it's not going to show up there. Earlier on I had an example. Maybe I can do this. Okay, this is a live view of the Ethereum network. So you can see blocks being produced. So the blocks are at the top there, all the green blocks with numbers. There's 7 million or so. The things, these circles closer, the ones here, these are transactions being added to the Ethereum blockchain. Blocks are added in Ethereum about every 12 to 15 seconds. So you can see that one will come along fairly soon, and as you see, the transactions that are available in what's called the transaction pool will get added into a new block. There you go. So this new block appearing on the Ethereum network, and you can see there are things here linking all the blocks together as we go along. So it's quite a nice view there. And this will just go on. As I say, we've got about 7 million blocks. Every 12 to 15 seconds on Ethereum, we'll get a new block. New transactions will go in to the system. Okay. Okay. So that's how blocks are produced in a kind of an idealized way, what we put into the block data structure itself. But how does this really happen? I'm going to describe now the consensus mechanism called proof of work. So this is the consensus mechanism used by Bitcoin and Ethereum and various other blockchains. It's not the only consensus mechanism by any means. People have tried to do other ones, but this one is perhaps the simplest to understand. So if you look at it from a network point of view, and imagine Alice here, she wants to send in a transaction to the Bitcoin network, and these dots here represent nodes on that network, and the blue block here is the latest block on the network. So she submits a transaction, and it goes to one of these nodes. Now these nodes, when they get a transaction, they gossip the transaction around the system. This is called the gossip protocol for participants in the network. So they will start to send this transaction around to other nodes that they know about. And then at some point, a certain person on the system will incorporate this transaction into a block. So here we have a yellow block. Now to do that, is the person who wants to produce the block runs special software called mining software. So we call these people miners. You don't have to be a miner to participate in the system, but if you want to produce a block, you have to run special software to do that. But that block will be produced, Alice's transaction will be included in that, and the system will be updated to include the yellow block. At a later time, another block will produce, the red block. And it's important to understand that the state of the system, the absolute truth about our blockchain system, is given by all of the transactions, and those transactions being applied up to the latest block. And that is the only truth that we have about our system. You may disagree with it in some way, you may think that your transaction was a mistake or it should have been different, but the absolute truth about our system is only contained within the blocks. And so we can just carry on producing more and more blocks, as you saw there, which is fine, but it does present a kind of problem we haven't addressed, because we want a consistent view. We want everybody in our system to have a consistent view of what the truth is about our system, what the state is about our system at a particular time. So when we produce the latest block, say we want to know, exactly who has how many bitcoins, and we don't want any disagreement in our system about that. We want everybody to agree on that. We want consensus. So how do we achieve this? Because we could easily have the situation where a certain part of our network there on the left there is in one part of the world, so they have seen some transactions, these grey transactions, and yet another part of the network down here has seen the green transactions but not the grey ones. And so we have, our network is kind of split, our system is split into 3 points here. We have people who know about the grey ones, people who've seen neither, and people who know about the green ones. So we don't have consensus. So how do we achieve some consensus about this? How do we know what really is the state of our system at a particular point in time? And to do this, and we say, well, we're going to just choose one of these miners at random and say, okay, all of you are effectively equal. Everybody on this network is effectively equal. So why don't we just pick one of those miners at random and say, you choose the state of the system. Whatever you see, we will believe. You produce a block showing what you can see in our system, the transactions that you have, and everybody else on the network will accept your view of the system. And we'll do this at random. We try to make it fair. And that will work in a nice way because, as I say, all of the nodes are equal. So that is a way we can get around this way and we can achieve consensus. And if we've done this in a fair way, then everybody on the network will accept that and accept the latest block and say, that is the state of our system. But of course, that doesn't solve the problem because there is no central authority involved here. So how do we choose who is going to produce the latest block? How do we do that in a fair way without a central authority to pick a random number for us to find the miner who is going to produce the block? And so the way we do this in proof of work is we effectively have a race. So we say to the miners, okay, you're going to be involved in a race to produce the latest block. And this race involves solving a mathematical puzzle. This mathematical puzzle is extremely hard to do, but is extremely hard to solve, but extremely easy to do in theory, in the sense that what it involves is taking the data that is in a block. So you start to assemble a block, you get the transactions ready, and what you do is you take that data, you add some random number to it, which we call the nonce, you take a hash of all of that. If that hash is then within a certain range, then you have solved the puzzle. And you can then send your block out to the network and say to everybody, here, I've solved the puzzle, this is the latest block, please accept this. Now, this is very hard to solve, but it's very easy to verify. So when somebody receives this block, they can look at this proof of work, they can look at the nonce that you have chosen and work out the hash value that this produces. They can easily check that this is within the correct range. They can do this within milliseconds. But finding the nonce, finding this random value that will produce a hash within the correct range is extremely difficult. In Bitcoin, they have set this puzzle so that it takes, of all the people in the world who are doing this, and all the people are making individually billions of guesses per second. For all of those people, it will take them about 10 minutes before somebody finds a correct random value that will produce a hash in the correct range. Okay, so it's extremely difficult to do, but once you've done it, it's extremely easy to verify. There is special hardware out now to do this. There are specialized chips, ASIC chips, that will do these hash values extremely quickly. But even so, it still takes 10 minutes for one person to find the correct random value. Does anybody here get involved in mining? Okay. And you're part of a mining pool? Okay, so this, they don't do it themselves. They tend to join mining pools, which means that you're mining along with a lot of other people and you can share the reward. It's all good, but we also have another problem here to do with consensus. Because we're going along, we've got our blue block. Two miners at the same time could produce a block without being aware of each other. So they're being quite honest. A red block and a green block at the same time, and they both think that is the latest block. So once those two blocks... This microphone is giving out a bit. How do we decide which is the latest block for the next miner to mine on? How do we progress the chain? Upon the longest chain. Now, longest in this sense is not just the number of blocks involved, it is actually the amount of work that is involved. Shall I just give up on the microphone? Can you hear me at the back if I speak without the microphone? Yes, no. I'll try with that. Okay, yeah, I think you can hear that. Okay, so we have a problem. We have the red block and the green block, and we don't know which one to start with for the next, to mine on from. But yeah, we follow the longest chain, or what's called the heaviest chain. So the amount of work that has been involved in producing these can be seen very easily by everyone. And so the next person who mines a block will pick one of them that they have decided is the heaviest chain. And this is done by a heuristic. So everybody agrees on the rule of how this will be chosen. And so the next person comes along. So the beige block is produced because he has decided that the red block is part of the heaviest chain. So he will use that. And then the next one comes on mining on that block, and so on. And the green block gets left behind. It's effectively orphaned. And in Bitcoin, this really is just abandoned. The transactions within that are not lost. They will be included within other blocks. So if there were transactions in the green block that were not in the red block, they would be added into, say, the beige block or the blue block later on. So you do not lose data. The only thing that happens is the person who mined the green block will lose their reward for mining the block. So because for mining a block, you get a reward. In Bitcoin, at the moment it's 12.5 Bitcoins in the Bitcoin network. So the person who provided the green block will lose that. So he won't be happy, but the miner who produced the red block will be happy because he gets his reward. Okay. So that is roughly how blockchains work and how the proof of work consensus mechanism operates. Is that all okay? Are there any quick questions at this point so I can answer? Go on.
Because of the characteristics of blockchain, will it increase the load in the internet?
So the actual amount of data that is being passed around, I don't think is that great. I mean, these blocks in Bitcoin, they were limited to 1 megabyte at the time. There's been splits, they've gone to somewhere now 4 megabytes. I don't think it's a huge difference compared with streaming movies or something. Where there is a problem is the amount of energy required for this. So the amount of energy that is required for mining the Bitcoin network, a few months ago it was more than was being used by Ireland. It's a huge amount of energy. So environmentally this is a complete disaster because you're using all this computing power, using all this energy, but the results are just effectively thrown away. There's nothing useful about this other than proving that you've produced the latest block. So that is why people are trying to do other types of consensus mechanisms, trying to do mechanisms that don't involve using so much energy, but this is the simplest one, but other ones are coming along. Okay, so I'll talk now about the threat model and how attacks have happened against blockchains. Perhaps for a start we should think about why people would attack a blockchain, and I think this kind of illustrates it reasonably well. There's a huge amount of money involved in blockchains. So these were some attacks that have happened. Now, all of these, the ones on the right-hand side, they were not attacks against the blockchain protocol itself. They were just attacks against associated software, so against, say, websites, or they were fraudulent activities by people operating exchanges. But the amount of money involved is huge. So the Mt. Gox, I think that was from about 2014, that amount of bitcoins today was worth about $3 billion, I think. So there is a really huge incentive for people to attack blockchains. Because of the pseudo-anonymity as well of systems like Bitcoin, people see it as something that is very easy to get away with as well. You will face problems if you do hack one of these when you're trying to convert the tokens you've stolen back into fiat currency. But if you can pay for things in Bitcoin, for example, then maybe that's not a problem for you. But the incentive is definitely there to do this. So what kind of things have people done, and what attacks are possible? So I'm going to look at this in two ways. I'm going to start off with looking at attacks against the protocols, and then we'll look at attacks against particular applications on blockchain. So protocol attacks, the most well-known is what's called a 51% attack, or the double spend attack. The way this happens is that we're going along, we have our blockchain, we have some blocks produced, those blue blocks, and then we get one block containing a transaction. So for example, this transaction could be to buy something in the real world. This attack really depends upon something happening in the real world rather than it all being on blockchain. So for example, if I decide I'm going to buy a laptop from you for 10 bitcoins, I could give you 10 bitcoins. You could see that they've gone into this green block. So you can say, fine, so you give me the laptop. So now you think you have 10 bitcoins. I definitely have the laptop. But if I'm malicious, what I can do is to do a certain attack. And this relies upon me having a lot of hashing power on the network. And what I have to do is to produce a lot of blocks myself before any honest miners can produce some blocks. And what I do is I produce these red blocks. And in one of these red blocks, I produce another transaction spending those same bitcoins. So you think I've given you 10 bitcoins, but what I also do is give the same 10 bitcoins to somebody else or to myself and the red block. So both of these transactions can't happen. But if we have this situation where I've produced enough blocks, then when the honest miners come in and produce another block, so in this case the blue block, they will see this as the longest chain, so they will include my malicious blocks. They will include the transaction where those bitcoins come back to me or go to my friend. So I will get these bitcoins back, but I also have a laptop, and you've lost out. Okay, so this is the 51% attack, and it relies upon the malicious attacker having enough hashing power, having a majority of hashing power on the network to be able to produce blocks faster than the honest miners can do so that they can do something malicious. Now, malicious miners in a blockchain can only do certain things. So they can include or exclude certain transactions, but the transactions themselves can't be faked. So when people on the system accept transactions, they will validate those transactions. So malicious miners cannot do a fake transaction. They cannot give themselves bitcoins out of nowhere, for example, except for the reward that they have, but they cannot fake transactions in that sense. But they can decide to include or exclude transactions. Okay, so in the case of 51% attack, this double spend, what they try to do is to interact with somebody in the real world and then spend the coins elsewhere, and they've effectively fooled the person and got some goods, and got their goods and the tokens at the same time. And we'll see an example of this in a minute. Another example that is perhaps less common, but is certainly possible, and it doesn't require a majority of hashing power, but it does require perhaps about 33% of the hashing power on the network, is called selfish mining. And here again, we will have the malicious miner. He's producing the red blocks. And what he does is we'll have the blue blocks coming along. The malicious miner will mine a red block, but rather than putting it out to the network, he will keep it to himself. And he will wait until an honest miner tries to produce another block. So the honest miner comes along and produces the green block, at which point the malicious miner, if he has managed to produce 2 blocks in that time, he will send out his 2 red blocks, and he will get those included because that's the longest chain, and he will be ahead of the person who produced the green block. And effectively what he's doing, as well as getting the rewards for producing these blocks, he's wasting everybody else's time. So the person who did the green block will lose out, so he's wasting the time for the other people in the network. And this is called selfish mining. Okay, this is not so common, but it is certainly possible in theory. So there's a couple of attacks against the protocol, the proof of work protocol. If we have a look at some network attacks, it's possible to do a thing called an eclipse attack. And the idea behind this is if you imagine the blue nodes here are honest nodes on our system. In an eclipse attack, what you try to do is to isolate one of these honest nodes from the network. And so this might be a prelude to doing a double spend attack, for example. So you may want to exclude somebody from the network who is you're going to buy something from. And what you do is you try to exclude them so they're not getting a consistent or a current view of the network. And instead you connect them to your malicious nodes, so the red nodes here, and you provide them with a view of the network that is not up to date or is skewed in some way. And from that point you can then manipulate what they do. You can persuade them that maybe some tokens have been transferred when they haven't, whatever. Again, this is not particularly easy to do. You have to attack their node software to do this. But again, it's certainly possible. And certainly if you're running a node in a company, you should be aware of this kind of thing. Another issue with networks or the system in general is the idea of centralization. So all of the sort of idealistic people who are interested in blockchains will say, these are great, they're decentralized systems. The reality is perhaps not quite so true. So now if we think about the mining hardware, one company, Bitmain, really has almost a monopoly on the mining software. So pretty much all of the mining software used in Bitcoin is produced by one hardware manufacturer. Now, I'm not suggesting in any way that they're doing anything malicious, but the possibility will be there for some companies to do this. If they could control most of the mining software, they could put a backdoor in, or they could restrict access to this mining software to certain people they favor, whatever. So that's a form of centralization that could occur. Second one, hash power. We've seen about a 51% attack, but what I'm talking about here is really the case that I've talked about mining pools. So the majority of people mining on Bitcoin will join pools. This photo from, I think that was 2015, these people were the owners of various mining pools, and between them I think they own about 90% of the hashing power of the Bitcoin network. Now, as long as they're in competition with each other and not colluding, that's fine. But if they decided to get together and collude to disrupt the network in some way, then there would be a problem. And there's an example back in about 2013, I think, where one mining pool did actually achieve 51% of the hashing power of the Bitcoin network, and this caused a lot of panic amongst people. People were very worried that they would do something malicious, and people intentionally left that mining pool so that their percentage of hash power dropped below 50%. So this is, although in theory we have a decentralized system, in practice it's easy for there to be centralizations in terms of hashing power and hardware. Another potential for attack that will be coming up is to do with quantum computing. And this is attacking the cryptographic primitives that I spoke about earlier. So hash functions and asymmetric cryptography. Hash functions are probably less at risk from quantum computing at the moment. It's more the public-private key pairs that are at risk. With Bitcoin, this risk is particularly against transactions that haven't yet been included in a block. So if you've sent your transaction out onto the network, it is possible for someone, or it could be possible for someone with a quantum computer to crack your private key, because they will be able to work out your public key from that transaction. Once it's included in a block, they can't affect it in the same way. So they'll have about 10 minutes in which to do this. This is, at the moment, not too much of a problem, because the the mining hardware. The ASICs that are doing the mining, that are doing the hashing power and producing these blocks every 10 minutes are faster than quantum computers are, and it is thought that this will be the case for about the next 10 years, so we're not needn't worry about this for about 10 years. But certainly in the future, quantum computing and cracking some of the cryptographic primitives via quantum computers will be a problem. There are other ways of producing the cryptographic functions. At the moment we rely on certain elliptic curves, but there are different ways of producing these that are quantum resistant. So I think that what we will see is a move towards those to be used by blockchains in the future. Okay, so that's the typical attacks at the protocol level. I want to talk now about application level. So the Bitcoin network is really just about transferring value. You're just transferring Bitcoins from one person to another. That's all it does. People have tried to extend it a little bit, but that's pretty much all it will do. After Bitcoin was produced, the next real step in blockchains came around with Ethereum and their ability to run smart contracts on a blockchain. What everybody says about smart contracts is the first point there. They're not really contracts, and they're probably not that smart either. So they really are just small applications, small pieces of code that run within a blockchain system, such as Ethereum. Because this application is on the blockchain, they cannot be changed, so the code, once it's there, cannot be interfered with, which provides trust for the people who are using these. The code is mutable, as I say. They run in a very constrained environment. If you try to program smart contracts on Ethereum, you will realize that there's a lot of things that you want to do that you can't do. And they are very inefficient. So on the Ethereum network, when you have a smart contract, if you try to run a function within a smart contract, every node on the Ethereum network will run that function, run that piece of code at the same time. So you're duplicating the work around the network. So many thousands of people will be running the same piece of code at the same time. So that's hugely inefficient from a performance point of view. When I first came across this, I was really surprised because I came from a high performance background. But it's not about performance here. The Ethereum is about getting trust in your application, having trust in your smart contract. And so because everybody is running the same piece of code and they will get the same results, it's completely deterministic, they can have trust in what your contract is doing. And so the vulnerabilities at the application level are really just about contracts that are badly designed or written. It's not generally the fact that the smart contract or the Ethereum virtual machine is a problem in itself. It's really to do with badly written code. So let's just look at some examples. I'll talk about some examples of attacks at the protocol level. So I explained to you a 51% attack, and one of these happened recently. So there's a currency called Ethereum Classic, and a couple of months ago, January, this was attacked by a 51% attack. As a result, there was a loss of about $1 million, I think, and trading in Ethereum Classic was shut down on various exchanges when they realized this attack was happening. The way this happened, it's very similar to what I said before. So we had our good blocks coming along, and then we got someone who went away and produced, I think he produced about 100 blocks. He mined about 100 blocks faster than the honest miners could mine, and he invalidated a transaction. So he went to an exchange and sold the exchange some Ethereum Classic, and he got back some fiat currency for that. So it was $1 million, whatever it was. He then, in the blocks that he produced, he then invalidated that transaction by doing a transaction that also spent those tokens, which meant when he submitted all his blocks to the system and the system reorganized itself and took his blocks as being the correct ones on this chain, he got his money, and effectively he got his tokens back as well. And he got away with about $100 million. Strange thing was he then gave some of it back. I really don't know why. He gave back about 10% of that. It seems to be a thing that often people who've done these type of attacks, and there's another one we'll talk about later, often give back part of their ill-gotten gains. And whether this is to provide sympathy for them or to prevent people trying to track them down, I don't know, but this has happened, and he did that. But it really made, the other bizarre thing about it was it didn't really affect the price of Ethereum Classic, which you might think that people would suddenly lose confidence in it, but it didn't seem to affect that. And there is a website you can go to which will tell you how much it costs to do a 51% attack. Now, I should make it very clear, I am not suggesting that any of you do this. So please do not do this. This is just for information only. But you can go to this website, and it will tell you how much it will cost you to buy the mining, to rent the mining hardware, to do a 51% attack against various cryptocurrencies. So at the top, you've got, Bitcoin and Ethereum is going to be very expensive. But some of them are exceptionally cheap, and so it's quite surprising that this doesn't happen more often. I think Ethereum Classic there at the moment, yeah, it's about $5,000 an hour. You can hire the hardware to do this and do a 51% attack. But please don't do that. But as I say, it's quite surprising this doesn't happen more often. Okay, another example of a protocol vulnerability was on the Zcash network. So Zcash, anybody? I don't think you own Zcash. Anybody own Zcash here? Oh, yeah, you own some. Okay. So there was a vulnerability in Zcash, and this was really a vulnerability in one of the original papers about zero-knowledge proofs. So Zcash is a type of currency that works because of technology called zero-knowledge proofs, and this makes it essentially an anonymous currency, or it can be anonymous. You can send a transaction in Zcash where you hide the originator and the receiver of the transaction and the amount that was transferred. And this is based on zero-knowledge proofs, and there was a paper that describes the mathematics of this paper here. But there was a mistake in the way that the paper was written, and this was also carried into the Zcash protocol. And so for about a year, the people running Zcash knew that there was a potential problem in their system. They kept quiet about it and worked on a fix, which they then released. What it could have done was allow people to essentially pay themselves an unlimited amount of Zcash without it being ever coming to light. They don't think this has happened because they don't think anybody else knew about this, and they've now put a fix in the latest version of Zcash. But it was there for a while, so we never can be really sure. There are some other technologies such as Mimblewimble and the Grim coin, where it would be more obvious if this kind of thing happened, which is I think one of the disadvantages to Zcash is that you could never be really sure whether this kind of inflationary attack has happened. Okay, thank you. Okay, let's talk about some attacks at the application level. My favorite is an attack that happened in 2016 on the DAO. The DAO was effectively a crowdfunding application, so people would put money into this smart contract, and then the smart contract would have rules as to how this money would be paid out to particular projects. There was a lot of hype around this, and at the time, I took this screenshot when it just closed its funding, and as you can see here, he raised $220 million. And this $220 million was controlled entirely by a smart contract, entirely by that application. Nobody could go in and move that money. It was just the contract itself, just the application that controlled it. They kept saying, code is law, and that was the kind of catchphrase at the time, because only the code could move this money, had control over this money. And of course, the inevitable thing happened. Somebody discovered a vulnerability in the way the contract had been written. A couple of weeks later, these messages started appearing on social media. The way that it was being attacked it was relatively slow, the mechanism was being used, so which was quite fortunate, so it meant it didn't happen immediately. But it was being drained, you could see it happening, and it was going on for hours and hours. Until at one point, for reasons that we don't know, the attacker decided to stop doing this. I can't tell you the full story of this, it's fascinating, but we don't have time for that. But effectively, he got away with about $50 million worth of cryptocurrency. And it caused a fork in the Ethereum network, caused a lot of problems, and it caused people to really start to take security seriously in these things and to really look at what they were doing in their smart contracts. This is a cartoon from the time. This represents the Ethereum network. This is the DAO, which had the attack. This is the Bitcoin people. there's always been antagonism between Bitcoin and Ethereum, so they're looking on amused at what had happened. It was a bad thing for Ethereum. A lot of people lost trust in Ethereum. The price of Ether dropped massively at the time. But on the plus side, it did get people to start to think about how contracts are written. Another more recent one, there's a company called Parity, who I absolutely love. They're a great company. They've got very talented people, so I'm not having a go at them here. Please understand that. But they produced a multi-sig wallet. It got hacked once because of a fairly simple vulnerability in the wallet, and someone made off with tens of millions of dollars because they could go in and drain people's wallets of the currencies they had. But they fixed it, and then shortly afterwards it got hacked again. And what happened in the second hack was somebody realized that this wallet was using a utility contract, and they worked out a way to kill this contract, which effectively froze all the wallets. So everybody who was using one of their wallets and had cryptocurrencies in those wallets effectively lost control of their currency. They couldn't move their currency. The guy who did it posted this on Twitter. He calls himself DevOps199, and he said, I didn't mean to do this, it was a mistake, and you can get a t-shirt with him shrugging and all this. Most people think he did this on purpose, and it wasn't a mistake after all. And he caused a lot of problems. Millions of dollars worth of currency is now locked up in these wallets, which will never be released. So companies have lost out in a very real way because of what he did. Okay, so there are other smart contract problems, some simple ones. Somebody wrote a casino contract, and the random number seed was contained in a transaction. This is in a public network, so all the data going into that contract can be seen. So everybody could see the random number seed that they were using for their casino. So anybody could then just work out what numbers they were going to produce in their casino. So really, really simple error there. Obviously, they got hacked. Okay, good practices. The protocol level, look at game theory, do simulations, do bounty programs to get people to hack your network, test network, and look at the distribution of hash power to make sure that nobody can do a 51% attack. In the application level, try things like formal verification. Use tools that will formally verify what your contract is doing and prove that your contract cannot get into a state that is vulnerable in some way. And there's a lot of research being done in that area. Here is a paper from Microsoft about that. There are tools as well you can use to check your contract for vulnerabilities. There's a couple there. So please, if you're in this area, please take security seriously. Some interesting technology that is coming up that I would encourage you to get involved with if you can. I've already mentioned zero-knowledge proofs. They're not necessarily connected with blockchains, but they are going to be increasingly important. They help with privacy, with scalability on blockchains, and security. Proxy re-encryption helps with the user experience and key management. Homomorphic encryption, great technology again, it's still not quite there. You just don't have it. Fully homomorphic encryption is still difficult. When these things mature, they will have a big impact on blockchains and really help security. If you're interested in this area and you want to get involved, there are a number of ways I suggest you can approach this. Companies are putting out grant programs. So this is from the Ethereum Foundation. I'm sorry, you can't read that very easily. But there are a number of areas that you can use. They will give you grants if you want to help them improve the Ethereum network in many different ways. Also, Zilliqa, another blockchain based on Ethereum, have a grants program as well. So do check these out. There are bounty programs for various networks as well. If you're going to hack them, please become a white hat. Don't join the dark side. There are groups who will go in when vulnerabilities are found and will try and drain people's balances that are at risk. So here's a photo of people doing just that. So when vulnerabilities were found, they went to vulnerable wallets, drained out the funds that were at risk, and then returned them to their rightful owners once the vulnerabilities had been fixed. So if you're going to hack these networks, please join the white hat groups. Finally, an area that I'm involved with, I'm involved with a company, I work on blockchain, who we provide workshops. So we run workshops in London pretty much every weekend. We run some sort of workshop for developers to teach them how to develop on blockchain. These are all free for developers. We would love to do them elsewhere, so we're happy to travel. If you know of a company who would want to sponsor us for this, we'd be happy to travel out and do them in Poland. But we offer them for free to everyone. We don't get paid for this. We're trying to get more people into this area. We think it's a great area to be involved with. Work on Blockchain also can match you up if you're interested in this area. They can match you up with companies who are looking for developers. So please check those out. If you'd like to contact me, there's my contact details, my email address, Twitter handle. If you're interested in the workshops, if you're going to be in London, just look at that website and you will find out the ones that are coming up. As I say, there are usually ones most weekends. There's a great book as well on blockchain security. There's a link there. So please also check that out. That goes into much more detail than I have had time to do. Okay, that's the end of my talk. I'll hand you back.
Thank you very much for your lecture. Before we move to the question part, I'd like to invite all of you to our contest. It's a good time event, but it's worth it because there is an Lego milestone set to win, also some Xcam vouchers and our t-shirts. Also, I'd like to invite you to the contest made by our sponsor Xcam, where you can win 1,000 Polish voucher. Okay. And also there is our social media contests picture. Information about them you can find on our website. So now let's move to the questions. Is there anybody? Okay.
Thank you for the lecture. I would like to ask, I have read the papers that states the blockchain can be used in the future for generic business transactions. So there will be no fee involved that can be cut from a third business company. There is no need even for royalties. So my question is, will those third parties put up a fight against the blockchain? Thank you.
Okay, so you're asking, are we capable of getting rid of the middlemen because of the lack of fees? Yes, definitely. So I've spoken here mainly about cryptocurrencies, but a lot of my work is involved in writing enterprise applications, for example, supply chain applications, where we are doing just this. We are trying to remove the middlemen, produce less friction between the people who are conducting a transaction. What I'm seeing at the moment is that the traditional players in this area are trying to get involved and do this themselves so that they are not being excluded, so maybe they're trying to control this area. I don't know, it's difficult to speculate on that, but this area is certainly possible. But it will take time because there are a number of things that really need to be developed to make this achievable, things like identity systems and reputation systems. So we're at quite an early stage, but these things are progressing, definitely, yes.
Thank you for your question. Please come later to receive a t-shirt. Are there many? Okay.
Can you briefly explain the process of generating the public and the private key in the system?
Sure. So generating public and private keys, this is just a very simple process that you just need to run some key generation software. What this essentially does is it takes a random value. If you run this on your laptop, it will take some random value based on some entropy from your laptop, so on mouse movements or something like that. And from that, it generates a public and a private key. And they're generated at random, so there's no effectively registry of keys. So they just rely on the fact that because the numbers involved are so huge, the chance or the probability of a collision between keys is incredibly small. So these keys are just generated at random, but they're generated in pairs, and the public and private keys are associated with each other. Yeah.
Thank you. Does anybody else have a question? Okay, maybe.
I know that you could use quantum computing to calculate and break cryptography, but I'm curious about using it in hashing, because you could have a set of qubits and you could create this extra salt, adding to all of them, and you could, I think, speed up hashing also on quantum computing?
Okay, so I should say I don't know very much about quantum computing, so you probably know more than I do about that. But all that I've read is that the dedicated hardware that people use at the moment for mining on Bitcoin that does the hashing power, at the moment it is faster than can be done with a quantum computer, and they think that's going to be the case for the next 10 years. But eventually, yes, quantum computers will be able to do that more quickly. Perhaps by that time, though, we will be using a different mechanism to produce the consensus. Yeah.
Thank you. I saw that you also had a question.
When you were talking about the proof of work concept, you mentioned that there are works on other consensus protocols. Can you quickly outline them?
Yes. So because of the environmental disaster associated with proof of work, people have tried other things. They usually start off with the name proof of ... So we have the main one, and the one that Ethereum is going to move to is called proof of stake. But there are other things like proof of elapsed time, proof of space. With proof of stake, this is a much more complex system. The idea is that people will stake an amount of some currency, and then if you've staked enough, you can be chosen to then produce a block. If you do something malicious, you will lose your stake. So the disincentive there is the fact that you will lose a certain amount of currency that you have staked for that. The problem with proof of stake is just that it's more complex, so to be able to reason about it mathematically is much more difficult compared to proof of work. Proof of work is very simple to reason about, so you can make very valid assumptions about that, of how it will work and the game theory involved and how people will interact in your system. With proof of stake, it's much more difficult. It's taking people much longer to come up with a mechanism that they can be sure of will work from a game theoretic point of view. Yeah.
Thank you. Anybody else? Okay.
How far away do you think we are from achieving a technology that would be able to operate on a truly global scale and at a speed comparable to, for example, Visa, like tens of thousands of operations per second, and would be able to fight the shortcomings of Bitcoin, like the fact that fees are becoming increasingly important, and in the future this would be definitely a problem?
Okay. So there's a question about scalability. So as you point out, the Bitcoin network is nowhere near the Visa network in terms of number of transactions it can do. Bitcoin can do roughly 7 transactions per second, which is really not adequate. And the fees can become quite dramatic. So just over a year ago, it could cost you $20 to send a transaction on Bitcoin. So if your transaction was for less than $20, it really made no sense. There are other blockchains coming around, so that really will focus on trying to achieve scalability, but they often lose out in other ways. Ethereum, for example, can do more transactions per second, but there are different types of transactions, and they're still not achieving the Visa speeds. But there are other systems like EOS claiming that they can do many more. If you have private networks, so where you restrict the amount of people that can join, you can produce better speeds. So I've built private networks, private blockchains, where you can get like 1,000 transactions per second. But you generally have a trade-off between security, these things. So you may get more transactions, but you may have less security, or you may have more centralization. So for example, the EOS system is much more performant, but you do have some degree of centralization with that. Yeah. So we're still a way away from those kind of speeds. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Maybe the last one question? Okay.
Values of cryptocurrencies are lessening or growing really fast. Do you think it's possible to make stable value of cryptocurrencies?
Okay, so this is about the volatility of cryptocurrencies. So so I mean, Bitcoin, for example, a year ago, I think it was $20,000 per Bitcoin. Now it's down to about $4,000. Has been extremely volatile within its lifetime. There are some cryptocurrencies that are tethered to fiat currencies. So you have some currencies that are tethered to, say, the US dollar. So they will issue you with one tether in exchange for $1, and at a later point you can give back your tether and you will get back $1 for it. So there are currencies such as that do generally work. There have been some problems with that one, but tethered currencies do work, and they are increasing. The ones that are left to float freely have been recently very volatile. But then we've seen a lot of hype around blockchain recently, or certainly in the last couple of years. We're seeing less hype now, so perhaps they will become less volatile.
Thank you for your attendance and activity. And before we leave, please give a big round of applause for our speaker.